Hello and welcome to another Vinimark Podcast. In today's episode, we get to chat to Nadia Hefer, one of the driving forces behind the Old Vine Project. It's an initiative that exists to protect certified heritage vineyards in the South African winelands. The momentum of the project has been building incredibly over the past few years to the point where it has now got over 130 members. And the project's gold seal is not only recognized in South Africa, but around the world as a measurable value add to the wine concern. Nadia has been involved with the Old Vine Project since 2018, and today we're talking about a new project that she's been spearheading, which involves the development of a digital education platform designed to equip wine industry professionals and inform the public on the value of old vine wines. So Nadia, thanks so much for taking time to chat to us today. I really appreciate that you are very busy, even on a Friday afternoon.
Hi, Jono. Thank you for having me. It's great to share this initiative with you.
Well, I thought for those who may not be familiar with the Old Vine Project, perhaps we can start with a little bit of background. Can you tell us about the genesis of the Old Vine Project?
The Old Vine journey started a few years ago, back in 2002, when our founder, Rosa Creer, started to taste old vines internationally. And then Rosa returned to South Africa and she started to ask the question, where are all of the old vines in South Africa? So Rosa, along with a few other viticulturalists, started to look for these old vines and started to document where they are. And this was in a time before email was accessible to everyone. So they literally phoned farmers, they drove around and searched for these old vineyards. We then started to see a few old vine wines appear in the markets. And then in 2014, Savas provided Rosa with a list of all of the old vineyards in South Africa. And this was shortly followed by the formalization of the Old Vine Project, and that was done with the support of the Rupert Foundation. And then Andre Morgenthal, our Old Vine Project manager, was appointed in 2016. And then since 2016, we've really seen this category grow. We've seen the Old Vine status increase with 40%. And as you mentioned, we now have over 130 members that are part of the Old Vine Project. And there's a lot of momentum that is being gathered with research being done. There are more and more producers creating specific old vine wines. And we see the trade media just sharing our old vine story internationally. And we see that there's a distinct category being created. But that being said, we always want to remember that we foster a culture of caring for our vineyards and caring for the people that tend to our vineyards. And this is not only for old vines, but for viticulture in general in South Africa.
Would it be correct to say that the South African wine industry had an almost weirdly well-developed set of documents from back in the day that other countries didn't have, and this really helped at the beginning of the Old Vine Project?
Yes, absolutely. We are very privileged to have SAVIS, which is the South African Wine Industry Information Systems, and they have these plant records that date back to the 1900s. And this is really something that, especially when the Old Vine Project was formalized, that has been instrumental in our success and something that is very unique to South Africa.
I always chuckle at how wine farmers and winemakers these days often curse Savas for their bureaucracy and the need for all the paperwork. But because of that bureaucracy, that's exactly why we have such a strong record and where we can accurately prove that vines were planted when they were planted.
Absolutely agree.
So I wanted to ask you that the Old Vine Project decrees that a vine in South Africa has to be 35 years or older in order to be declared a certified heritage vineyard or part of a certified heritage vineyard. Can you give some insight into how that data came about? What is so special about the 35-year age bracket?
When the Old Vine Project was formalized, there wasn't a manual or a specific guideline or any official age for an old vine. And that's where Rosa had to sort of determine the age. Now, with that, we know a few things about vineyards as they age in South Africa. These old vines seem to be naturally less vigorous, and they also decrease in their yield. Another point that's very interesting, specifically in South Africa, is that the old vineyards doesn't necessarily have a deeper root system. It has a denser root system. In the book Vine Roots, which was written by Eben Archer and David Simon, they show that old vines don't necessarily have that deeper roots, but they have an increase in root mass as they age. So taking all of these facts into account, and along with the fact that Risa always says if a vineyard can survive for 35 years in our harsh climate, it really does deserve to be called an old vine.
That's quite an interesting point because I think a lot of people talk about how old vines have these deep root systems and that's why they can survive better, or that's how they outlast harsh conditions more so. But you're saying that it's actually got to do with the density of the root network, not necessarily how deep they go into the soil.
Yes. So in this specific study, it was shown that as a vineyard ages, the root density increases, and that normally like the growth and the expansion of roots are influenced by the physical properties of the soil. And this really influences the vineyard when it is younger and when it is growing. So as the vineyard ages, it will become denser.
And is it fair to say that at this 35-year age bracket, the wine that starts to come from the fruit in the vines is different?
Yes, definitely. And there's also research that shows that juice from younger vines and the juice from older vines are different. And this was a study that was done by Professor Johan Berger, where he compared the grapes and the juice from old vine pinotage compared to young vine pinotage. And he found that older vines have significantly higher acid at a lower bulling and thus a lower alcohol and a better pH. So we do get a lot of research that shows there's a difference between old vineyards and young vineyards.
That's incredible. So there is a sense that winemakers are always chasing acid, making sure it stays where it's supposed to without dropping while they wait for sugars to rise. You're saying old vines essentially have learned how to hold on to their acidity for longer while the sugar levels are rising in the grapes.
Yes, and especially in a time of climate change, we learn a lot from these old vineyards.
Whenever I listen to you or Rosa or Andre talk about old vines, it's very clear to me that they're these magical, mystical creatures that are really worthy of respect. And it's fascinating hearing about the physiological changes and just how they behave differently in their environment. And to me, it seems obvious that you'd want to protect these things. Yet it wasn't always obvious when you guys were trying to get the Old Vine project going. And I know that there was a struggle to get momentum in the beginning. Can you talk a little bit about what the biggest hurdles were in the early days to get momentum behind the Old Vine project?
Andre, our project manager, often shares the story that it was very challenging in the early days to get the producer sellers on board with the project. So a lot of the old vines are situated within these large producer seller systems. So initially it was quite of a challenge to convince them to separate their old vine fruit and to make old vine wines. But luckily now we have seen that these producers have identified the quality of the old vines and the wine that they produce. And we now have quite a few producer sellers that are proudly part of the Old Vine project. We've got producer sellers such as Kulenhof, DGB, Uni Wines that are really producing fantastic old vine wines.
So what do you think it was that brought about the shift? How did Andre go about convincing them to go to the extra trouble of keeping these old vine parcels of fruit separate?
I think a lot of difficult conversations. And if you listen to the producers telling the story, they started to notice the quality. And I think it's not only the romance, but they noticed the quality of the vineyard or of the wine that the vineyard produced. So it made sense for them to keep the juice separately. It makes financial sense to keep the juice separately because you can create a product that's differentiated, that's unique, that tells the story. So it does make sense for them, not only from a quality perspective, but from a perspective to sell the wines.
We had a time when it was difficult to convince producers and especially some of the bigger co-ops, but you succeeded in doing that. And now you've got this massive sense of momentum and growth, over 130 members. It feels like you guys are already very busy just trying to administrate and manage this process. But then you guys embark on what feels like an enormously ambitious educational project. Can you tell me how this project came about? What was the driving force that made you guys feel like this is something we want to invest in?
Education and skills development has always been an important part of the Old Vine project, and it's really part of our DNA. So we are very excited about this new project that we are launching soon, which is an online education system. But before I get to that, I just want to share a little bit about the background on how this all started. Vinimark is a wine brand that was created by a group of German wine industry members during the COVID pandemic, specifically to support our South African wine industry. So they created a first wine. It's called Vinimark, and it's an old wine blend of Cinsault and Pinotage. And it was made by the Cape Winemakers Guild Protégé program under the guidance of Andrea Malini and Andre Morgenthau. So the Imviniwetu slogan is, alone we can do so little, but together we can do so much. That was really demonstrated by the team pledging the proceeds of the wine sales to empowerment and heritage programs in the Cape Winelands. So this really enabled us to kickstart the development of our online course. And the purpose of the Academy's first course is to educate members of the trade who operate on restaurant floors, in retail outlets, on the value of old vine wines. And these are the people that engage with consumers the most, and they play such a crucial role in the value chain of old vines. So we want to take this online course to our Old Vine Project members, educational establishments, and other industry role players who want to know more about old vine wines.
I love that saying, alone we can do so little, but together we can do so much. And that the Old Vine Project has held this as a central value from the beginning. And this is not the first educational initiative that you guys have embarked on. Can you tell us about some of the other work that you've done?
This has definitely been part of the Old Vine Project since its inception. And we always aim to do skills development in the vineyard, and specifically to improve the vineyard worker's knowledge of his trade. Along with the pruning share manufacturer Falco Africa and Imviniwetu, we present annual in-person pruning classes to vineyard workers. And this forms the practical component of the Old Vine Academy.
So I understand that there are special skills that are required for pruning old vines that you may not need for general pruning of grapevines. Are we at the point where there are levels of qualifications or skills development where people who have been trained to prune old vines actually have a higher market value or can be employed at a slightly better work rate?
Jono, that is a very tricky question to answer. We don't have the concrete proof, so I would rather not comment on that one.
Obviously, I know that you personally have a lot of experience in the development of educational material, not only inside the Old Vine Project, but outside as well. But I wondered if there were any unforeseen challenges or setbacks that occurred during the development of this course.
I think with many big projects, the scope often increases as you find out more information. So I think managing all of the information and deciding what is relevant and crucial, that was a big challenge. But in saying that, we conducted so many interviews with Old Vine Project members and industry professionals. And something that really stood out during this process is how positive people are about old vineyards in South Africa. And there's really this sense of wanting to pay forward their knowledge, pay forward their expertise. It was fantastic to see this passion from people in our industry.
Well, that's great to hear that rather than obstacles, there was actually unexpected support. So let's turn our attention a little bit to the syllabus because I really want to come to grips with what this course involves. I looked at Module 1 and saw that it deals with the appeal of old vine wine. And then further down, Module 10 deals with how to sell old vine wine. I wondered if you could just give me a little bit of insight into how are those two different? Because it feels like if we are talking about the appeal of old vine wines, that is how you sell old vine wine.
Jana, absolutely. Talking about the allure of old wines is definitely part of the sales process. In terms of the course, Module 1 explains the why. Why are old vines different? It reflects on the life cycle of old vineyards, whilst Module 10 is the how to use the old wine sales toolkits to best sell these wines. And what we've seen, it's not only the allure or the romance of old wines that makes them desirable for trade to sell, but we've seen that trade has been rewarded in selling these old vine wines, and that consumers are now recognizing that these are interesting wines, different wines, and wines that have a story. And we've seen a remarkable growth, especially For example, with restaurants beginning to have old wine sections on their wine lists. We see old wine sections within wine shops. This is both in retail and online. So we definitely seeing this strong connection between the story and actually how trade can use this allure of old wines to sell wines.
If I understand correctly, there are countries around the world like Chile and Australia who have their own old vine programs, but do they have their own old vine curriculums as well?
There are certain countries that are now rolling out old vine curriculums, but there's nothing in terms of the South African context that is similar to the course that we are doing.
So that's what I wanted to know, because it feels like you guys have gone to a lot of hard work in order to develop this curriculum. I wondered how much of it is useful to other countries, or would you say that actually the data that you guys have gathered is really specific to a South African vineyard context?
So that's a very good question. The Old Vine Academy's first course covers a lot of the foundational information to provide a basic structure. We then focus on old vines with a specific focus on South Africa. So someone that's not necessarily from South Africa and someone that doesn't necessarily know wine that intimately will still find this course beneficial. And we've seen that there's been a lot of interest from trade and consumers from outside of South Africa wanting to know specifically what makes our old vines in our country unique and different.
What does make South African old vines unique and different?
I think people would need to get the course to find out.
Okay, fair enough. Then I'll move on to my next question, which was, and it's a little contrarian, because I know there have been some South African winemakers who have been very vocal about how they don't feel that old vine juice and therefore old vine wine is necessarily different to younger vines. It was lovely to hear you talking about hard data earlier to say that actually at a chemical level, the juice does seem to be different. The vines do seem to produce a different quality. So what material in the course is there that helps salespeople and trade people to actually address some of that controversy?
So it is also important to note that we're not saying all old vines make good wines that are better than younger vines, but they are different. So we've touched on data earlier, so I just want to reflect on that again. The one study that we have in South Africa is the study done by Professor Johan Burger at Stellenbosch University, where he compared the old and the young vine pinotage, where he discovered that there are differences between the grape and the juice of young vines compared to older vines, and that these older vines have significantly higher acid at a lower boiling, thus a lower alcohol and a better pH. And then there's another study done by Dr. Helene Nieuwoud from Stellenbosch University and her team. And this study was done on the chemical profiling of old vine Chenin Blanc, and that they also discovered that there is a differentiation between old and young vines, or young vine wines, and that they identified certain aroma compounds that were found in old vine Chenin Blanc. And this actually led to the Chenin Blanc aroma wheel being updated with these new aromas and mouthfeels. So if we take these two studies, we can definitely say that there is a difference between old vine and young vine wines.
It gives me great comfort to hear you referencing peer-reviewed studies, because often we know that the wine world has this habit of embracing sometimes the romance of something at the expense of the science of it. I know people have talked about terroir historically, things like there's chalk soils, therefore there's chalk in the wine. It's stuff that is said because it sounds good, but it actually isn't supported by science. So how have you guys navigated this when developing the course? Has there been a fairly rigorous commitment to always having scientific studies, or are there some elements that are anecdotal? Can you tell me kind of how you balanced the need for scientific rigor with also having a course that is comprehensive enough to be able to help people to have proper conversations?
So when we started the development, we looked at wine industry source literature, we consulted our wine industry competency framework, and we also had a look at other wine courses to establish what the framework for this course will be. Then we started the process to gather information and we looked at reliable sources such as academic articles, websites, and interviews with experts in our industry. So we really wanted to focus on getting quality information within the course. And then we are very lucky in South Africa to have these research studies that were done specifically on old vines. So we include interviews with Dr. Helene Nieuwoud, Professor Johan Berger, and Dr. Jonathan Stein. In addition to these, we also approached wine industry experts for practical tips and best practices. So there really is a balance in terms of, fundamental research, but then also how do you actually apply this to real life industry? So I would say there's a good balance between academics and practical tips within the course.
Talking about all the professors that you've interviewed and the scientific studies that you have used in the development of the course, I'm reminded of Rosa Creer being part of the Decanter Hall of Fame. Would it be correct to say that the people that we are working with in South Africa have become internationally respected as authorities on the topic?
Oh, absolutely. I think we can be very proud of what has been accomplished in South Africa, and especially the work that the Old Vine Project has done to essentially shape and build this category. I think we can be very proud about our people, our research, our vineyard workers, our winemakers, our growers, and especially people that spread the message that everyone is just standing together to make this an incredible story.
Am I correct in saying that there have been some international viticulturists who've been coming to South Africa specifically to learn from the Old Vine Project and the work that you guys have been doing here?
Definitely. There have definitely been a lot of site visits, conferences, seminars to determine why is South Africa so successful with our old vines. And it's great to share our best practices and knowledge with our counterparts in other countries.
I'm really asking these questions because it occurs to me that the modules and the curriculum that you guys are developing really has global significance simply because of the wealth of experience and experts that we have in the country. But I wanted to ask you another question about a module in the course. You have one on how to best serve old vine wines. And I must confess, this was something that I reacted with a sense of skepticism to it. I mean, do we really serve old vine wines differently to the way we serve wines from younger vines?
In this module specifically, we emphasize that you have to evaluate each wine for what it is and how to serve that particular wine. And yeah, I think you need to do that with every wine that you taste, whether it's a young vine wine or an old vine wine. In this specific module, we do a very interesting Riedel masterclass that just breaks down how you should evaluate a wine to select the best stemware to serve the wine in. There is unfortunately no one glass that fits all old vine wines. The same with when you prune an old vineyard, you have to look at that specific wine, analyze it for what that specific vine needs to better grow. And the same almost philosophy gets transferred to when you serve an old vine wine and any wine, you need to evaluate that wine for what it is and how it will best be served.
So the chapter is more about how to assess a wine and how it should be served as a result, than specifically focusing on old vines. Is that correct?
You can say that. However, we do use the examples of old vine wines. It's fascinating. We have a fascinating glassware tasting in this module.
One more question about the curriculum. I see that the Chenin Blanc gets its own module. Now, I understand that there are more old vine Chenin Blanc than any other cultivar in the country, but does old vine Chenin Blanc really behave differently to other cultivars that it needs to be dealt with in its own chapter?
Jonna, like you mentioned, there is a lot of old vine Chenin, and it forms a very important part of the old vine story and the South African wine story. So in this topic, we explore Chenin Blanc a little bit, and then we also have research done by Dr. Helene Nieuwoud, which we expand on. So we have a lot of interesting data on Chenin Blanc that we want to share in this module.
I really just want to make sure that we don't end this conversation without members of the public at least knowing how they can engage with this course. The course fee is 1,250 Rand. Is that correct?
That is correct. And the course is online and self-paced. So you can decide when you want to log in and when you want to complete the course.
And are there any group rates for educational institutions perhaps, or colleges, or is it simply that each individual needs to sign up on their own?
We do offer a 10% discount for educational institutions and groups above 10 people.
And would it be fair to say that the course is compatible with mobile devices so they can do it while they're waiting for an appointment or for their car to finish getting washed? They can be going through these modules on their mobile devices?
Yes, the course is compatible with mobile devices.
Last thing, for members of the public who are wanting to support or fund the Old Vine project, outside of obviously signing up for this course, what are some of the ways that they can do so?
If anyone wants to get involved, you can visit our website. It's www.oldvineproject.co.za, and you can visit our donation page. And all donations go towards projects like the Old Vine Academy, and also your involvement with the Old Vine Academy and the Old Vine Project will help to preserve these precious old vines, and you will also be able to support growers and to help our farming community farm more sustainably.
So Nadia, before we go, are there any things that you feel about the course that perhaps I haven't asked you about? I want to make sure that I don't miss this opportunity because I think this is such a great initiative.
One thing about the Old Vine Project that is really apparent to me is the sense of collaboration from people across the value chain. We've got some fantastic people talking on the course. We've got Masters of Wine, we've got Tim Atkin, Kathy von Sale, we've got winemakers, viticulturalists, all sharing their views on old vine wines. So this is a course that will be educational, but it will also be interesting and enjoyable to complete.
Nadia, thank you so much for taking time to chat to us. I know you have been very busy, but we are very excited to see this project come online, and I'm sure that Vinimark will be announcing this when the course is publicly available. And just thanks again for taking time to share all the hard work that you guys have done on this project.
Thank you, Jonah, and thank you for having me and sharing the Old Vine message.
We've reached the end of another episode of the Vinimark Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing to the channel so that you can join us for more conversations around wine commerce, wine science, cellar mastery, marketing, and the rising trends amidst the industry's more adventurous pioneers.